I need you to understand something before we start tonight. A tornado is not supposed to know you're there. It has no eyes, no brain, no nervous system, nothing that could possibly qualify as awareness in any scientific sense. It is a column of spinning air and pressure differential, and it does exactly what physics tells it to do every single time without exception. Except, according to the man who sent me tonight's story, exactly once in his entire life it didn't. He spent almost 30 years chasing storms across the plains, and he wants you to know up front that he can't prove one word of what he's about to tell you. He's not asking for your belief. He's asking for 90 minutes of your attention, and he's asking you to decide for yourself what you would have done on the day something out there decided it knew exactly where his family lived. Before starting, subscribe MY channel. I want to start by telling you a little about who I was before any of this happened, because I think it matters. I think you need to understand what kind of man I was on the morning of May 9th, 1991, so that you can understand exactly how much of that man never came back down out of that hollow with me that evening. I'll go by Grady in this story. That's not my real name, and I'd like to keep it that way if you don't mind, for reasons that I hope will make sense by the time I'm finished. I grew up in central Kansas, in a town small enough that everybody knew whose truck belonged to whom just by the sound of the engine coming down Main Street. My father sold farm equipment his whole life, and I always assumed I'd end up doing something similarly practical, something with my hands, something that put food on a table without asking too many questions of the universe. What I actually ended up doing was selling insurance, first as an agent and later as a claims adjuster, which, if you want the honest truth, is a job built almost entirely around understanding what weather does to the things people love. I spent 31 years walking through what wind and hail and fire leave behind, filling out forms, taking photographs, telling people in the gentlest voice I could manage exactly how bad the damage really was. But that was only ever half of what I did with my life. The other half started when I was 19 years old, standing in my parents' driveway on an April evening in 1978, watching a wall cloud build itself up over the horizon to the southwest like something out of the Old Testament. I didn't know what I was looking at that night. Nobody had taught me the words for any of it yet. I just knew that I could not look away, and that some part of me, some old animal part buried way down under 31 years of insurance forms and church on Sundays, wanted very badly to get closer to it instead of further away. By 1980, I was doing it on purpose. I bought myself a used Bronco, a 1977 model the color of dried mustard, and I started keeping a box of county highway maps under the passenger seat. The good ones you could get for free from the state highway department if you asked the right clerk nicely. Those maps showed every gravel road and every low water crossing in a 100-mile radius, and for the better part of a decade, that box of paper was the closest thing I had to real-time radar. I want you to understand what this hobby actually looked like back then, because I think people who've grown up with a live radar app on their phone have a hard time picturing it. There was no internet. There was no cell service, not even the beginnings of it, not out where I chased. What there was the local paper in the morning, the 6 o'clock forecast, the 10 o'clock forecast, and a NOAA weather radio bolted to my dashboard that squawked out county names in a flat, computerized monotone that sounded, if I'm honest, a little bit like a robot reciting a eulogy. On top of that, I had a CB radio with a whip antenna welded to my rear bumper, which on a good day would pick up other chasers a county or two away, swapping information about wall clouds and funnel sightings in a kind of shorthand that took me years to fully learn. Storm chasing as an organized hobby barely existed in 1980. There were maybe a few dozen serious chasers scattered across the entire country, most of them out in Oklahoma and Texas and the Panhandle, university researchers, and a handful of dedicated amateurs who'd caravan out onto the open plains every spring, trading film and swapping stories over campfires. Kansas had a few of its own, mostly working the flat western half of the state where you could see a storm building from 20 miles off and still have time to get in position. I chased the eastern part of the state instead, closer to home, where the land folds up into rolling hills and wooded draws and the roads follow old property lines instead of any sensible grid. It's beautiful country. It is also, without question, the worst possible terrain in the world for watching a tornado from any safe distance. You could be nearly underneath one and never see it coming until it was already tearing through the trees above you. The Oklahoma chasers used to laugh at me for staying home instead of driving 5 hours west for the open country. I used to tell them somebody had to watch my own backyard, and I meant it as a joke every single time I said it, right up until the one year it stopped being a joke at all. I met my wife in 1982 at a church potluck of all places, and I want to tell you honestly that she did not marry a storm chaser knowingly. She married a car salesman with a strange hobby, and it took her a couple of years to fully understand how much of my actual identity lived inside that strange hobby instead of behind the counter at the dealership. We fought about it early on. She'd read the same articles everyone else read about people getting killed doing what I did, and she wasn't wrong to be afraid for me. But somewhere around the third spring of our marriage, she stopped fighting me on it and started instead packing me sandwiches before I left the house. I've never told her how much that particular surrender meant to me, though I suspect she already knows. Our son was born in 1982 as well, and by the spring I'm about to tell you about, he was 9 years old and, in the words of his own second-grade teacher, a geological event in the shape of a small boy. He talked constantly about everything with the kind of relentless enthusiasm only a 9-year-old can sustain for an entire car ride. He'd been asking to come chasing with me since he was old enough to understand what I was doing at 4 in the morning, standing out in the backyard in my bathrobe with a cup of coffee, watching the dew point the way other men watch stock tickers. I'd promised him more than once that once he turned 13, old enough to understand real danger and respect it, he could finally ride along. He never got that ride. You'll understand why by the time this story is finished, and I want to tell you now, honestly, that the guilt of that broken promise has outlived almost every other regret I've ever carried. My brother's name for the purposes of this story was Walter. Everyone called him Walt. He was 2 years older than me and roughly a foot more stubborn, the kind of man who genuinely could not walk past a broken hinge or a loose board without fixing it on the spot, whether or not anyone had asked him to. He married a woman I'll call Ellen, who taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in town and graded papers on every flat surface of their house from August clear through May. They lived about 5 miles outside of town, down a stretch of gravel road that dropped off the highway into a low valley the locals had always called Miller's Hollow, the hills closing in gradually on both sides until you felt like you were driving down into the bottom of a bowl, with a creek running along the low end of it and woods pressing in on 3 sides of their 6 acres. Their house was small and white with a tin roof and a wraparound porch Walt had built with his own 2 hands, and I want you to hold on to that image of it clearly in your mind, because I'm going to ask you to remember it very precisely later in this story, when there's nothing left of it at all. I'm telling you all of this background not because I think it's especially interesting on its own, though I hope it hasn't bored you too badly, but because I need you to understand the shape of my life before that spring. I need you to understand that I was, by every measure that mattered to me, a happy man. I had a wife who packed my sandwiches, a son who talked too much, a brother who could fix anything, and a hobby that scared my mother half to death every April but had never once, in over a decade of chasing, cost me anything worse than a busted radiator hose and a couple of close calls I could laugh about over a beer. I want you to hold on to that man for just a little while longer because he's not going to survive what I'm about to tell you. Not really, even though his body walked out of that hollow under his own power and lived another 30-some years afterward. This brings me to my niece. I'll call her Marisol in this story, my brother's only daughter, and I want to tell you about her carefully because I think the version of this story where she's just a sick little girl who dies tragically misses almost everything that actually mattered about who she was. Marisol was diagnosed with leukemia at 9 years old in the fall of 1988, and I remember exactly where I was standing in the dealership showroom when Walt called to tell me, because I've replayed that phone call in my head more times than I could ever count. He didn't cry on the phone. Walt wasn't a man who cried in front of other people, not even his own brother over a long-distance line. But his voice had a flatness to it that I'd never heard from him before, a kind of careful control that scared me more than sobbing would have. The 2 years that followed were, by every account I ever heard from Ellen or from Walt himself, exactly as brutal as you'd imagine. Hospital stays in the city that stretched on for weeks at a time. Treatments that made a strong, opinionated little girl too weak to lift her own arms some mornings. I won't dwell on the details of that part because Marisol herself later on made it very clear to me on more than one occasion that she did not want to be remembered as a sick kid. She wanted to be remembered as herself, and I intend to honor that as best I can here. By March of 1991, after 2 years of treatment that had cost the family more than money, the doctors finally used the word remission. And I want to be very clear about something before I go any further into this story. We are not talking about a little girl who was fading away. We are talking about a girl who was, by every measurable sign, coming back to life. Walt called me at the dealership the day they got the news, and he was so happy on the phone that his voice kept cracking mid-sentence in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before, not even at his own wedding. I remember standing behind the counter grinning so wide it actually hurt my face. while a farmer waited patiently to ask about financing on a used pickup. Marisol would be going back to school that fall, a year behind her original class, and according to Ellen, she did not care one bit about being behind. He just wanted to go back. I want to paint you a picture of who she actually was that spring because I think it's important context for everything that follows. She was 11 years old, sharp as a tack, and had an opinion about absolutely everything, which she delivered with total confidence regardless of whether anyone had asked for it. She once told me my favorite flannel shirt was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen, and then, in the same breath, informed me that she loved it precisely because it was so ugly, and that I was under strict orders never to throw it away. I still have that shirt for what it's worth. I've never been able to make myself get rid of it. Her hair had grown back in that spring, maybe 2 inches long and standing straight up in a way that made her look, in Walt's words, like a very tiny, very fierce dandelion. She'd finally started putting weight back on too, which for a kid in her situation was its own kind of small miracle, the sort of thing you only fully appreciate if you've spent 2 years watching someone shrink. My son Tobias and Marisol had grown close over those 2 years in the particular way cousins sometimes do when one family is going through something the other family can only stand nearby and witness. We told ourselves and told the kids that they were going out there to visit so the two of them could play together, though by that spring, with Marisol still tiring easily on even a short walk to the mailbox, mostly what happened was that Tobias would sit with her on the end of her bed, or out on that porch swing Walt had built, and the two of them would talk for 2 solid hours about nothing at all. School gossip, made-up games, whatever 9-year-olds and 11-year-olds find endlessly fascinating about each other's daily lives. She treated him like a little brother, ordering him around with total confidence, and he loved every second of it, though he would have rather died than admit that to another living soul. I want you to hold on to this picture of the two of them laughing on that porch swing in the spring sunshine, because it's going to matter very much later in this story, and because I think it's the last truly uncomplicated memory I have of either of them before everything changed. We drove out there 2 or 3 times a week that spring, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not, in those visits, notice anything wrong at first. Nothing felt off. Nothing felt like the beginning of anything. It felt like a family getting its life back, slowly, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a time. And if you had told me then how badly all of it was about to end, I don't think any version of myself from that spring would have believed you. That's about a month before the nightmares started. I'll tell you about those next, and I want to warn you now before we get there, that this is the part of the story where I stop being able to tell myself comfortable lies about what was actually happening in that hollow. Part 3. The Man in the Field. About a month before everything I'm about to describe, Marisol started having nightmares. Ellen mentioned it to me first, standing in her kitchen one afternoon with a dish towel in her hands, worried enough about it that her voice shook a little as she talked. Her first fear, understandably, was medical. Some kind of pressure on the brain, some late reaction to 2 years of aggressive treatment finally showing itself. The doctors ran every test they could think of repeatedly, and every single result came back completely clean. But the nightmares kept coming anyway. A few nights a week, according to Ellen, Marisol would come up screaming out of a dead sleep, the way you'd expect from a genuine night terror, unable to fully calm herself down for a good while afterward. Walt would sit with her in the dark, holding her hand, telling her she was safe, and by his own account, it sometimes took the better part of an hour before her breathing finally slowed all the way back down to normal. I asked her about it myself once on one of our regular visits, catching her alone on the porch while Tobias was inside grabbing us both a Coke from the refrigerator. I felt a little guilty for prying, honestly, but something in me needed to ask. I told her as gently as I knew how, that her mom had mentioned she'd been having some bad dreams lately. She got quiet, a little embarrassed, the way kids get when an adult brings up something they've been trying to keep private. Then she told me quite seriously that they weren't really dreams. I asked her what she meant by that, and she started picking at the already chipped paint on the arm of the porch swing, not quite looking at me, before she said it was more like something that was actually there. I see a man in the field, she told me. I remember looking out at the hayfield across the road almost involuntarily, the way you do when someone mentions a specific place, even though I knew perfectly well there was nothing out there but hay and fence posts. I'd never once seen another living soul standing in that field in all the years Walt had owned the property. I asked her what the man did. Nothing, she said. He just stands there and points. I asked if he pointed at anything in particular. He said yes. He points at our house. I laughed. I want that on the record because I have never once forgiven myself for it, and I think it's important that you understand exactly how ordinary and dismissive my reaction was in the moment. I genuinely thought it was nothing more than an unusually specific, mildly eerie kid's nightmare, the kind of thing an imaginative 11-year-old might dream up after 2 years of hospital hallways and unfamiliar rooms. I teased her gently, told her that was one of the more boring nightmares I'd ever heard described, and got a real laugh out of her in return. Right before Tobias came back outside with our sodas and the conversation moved on to something else entirely. I've thought about that specific exchange more times than I could possibly count in the years since, and I feel even now a very particular kind of guilt about the laughing part. Not because I think there was any way I could have reasonably known better at the time. I don't believe that, not really, not even now. But because it was the first of several moments where the universe, or whatever you want to call the thing behind all of this, handed me a piece of the puzzle, and I set it down without looking at it closely enough. I want to add one more detail here, something I didn't mention to anyone at the time, including Ellen and Walt, because I genuinely didn't think it was connected. About 2 weeks after that porch conversation, I had a strange dream of my own, the only one I've ever had that I'd describe that way. I dreamed I was standing in my own backyard at night, and out past the fence line, in the dark field behind our property, I could see the vague shape of someone standing perfectly still facing the house. I couldn't make out any features. I only knew, with the strange absolute certainty dreams sometimes carry, that whatever it was had been standing there for a very long time already, and that it was in no hurry at all. I woke up before anything else happened in that dream, and I told myself it was nothing but an ordinary anxiety dream, brought on by too much coffee and worrying about a farmer's insurance claim I'd been putting off. I didn't think about it again until much, much later, when the pieces of all of this finally started arranging themselves into a shape I couldn't ignore anymore. By the start of that particular work week in early May, the forecast language coming out of the regional weather office had shifted into the kind of phrasing that a decade of chasing had trained me to take seriously. A system was building up out of the southern plains, expected to reach central Kansas by Wednesday or Thursday, and the 6 o'clock forecast that Monday used a phrase I'd learned to respect over the years. All modes of severe weather possible. That's the meteorologist's way of covering every base at once, which usually meant he was genuinely worried, even if the polite public phrasing never quite said so directly. I asked my boss for Thursday off, which by that point in my career had become such a predictable ritual between us that he barely looked up from his desk before waving me toward the door. Storm day, he said, the same 2 words he always said, followed by his standing joke about not wrecking one of the dealership's demo trucks doing it. I chased in my own Bronco that year, the same mustard-colored 77 I'd bought over a decade earlier, with a Nikon and 4 rolls of unopened film riding in the glove box alongside that same battered box of county maps. Wednesday night, my wife and I prepped the house the way we'd done dozens of times before. An interior hall closet with no windows, 2 couch cushions dragged in and stacked against the wall, a flashlight with fresh batteries set on top of them. I also dug out an old hard hat from a construction job I'd worked at 19 specifically for my son, who found the whole thing hilarious because it slid down over his eyes the moment he put it on, and made him look, in his own words, like a very confused turtle. "But you put this on if you hear the siren," I told him, trying to keep my tone light even as I meant every word of it seriously. He rolled his eyes the way 9-year-olds do at instructions they've heard 100 times before, but he repeated the plan back to me anyway, word for word, the way I'd taught him. "Hear the siren, get to the hall closet, put on the hard hat, don't argue with your mother." The siren itself, I should explain, was something of a running joke in our particular corner of the county. Our town had one mounted up on the water tower, and on a calm day you could hear it clearly from most of the residential streets. But out at the edge of town on a windy afternoon, you'd have real trouble making it out at all. And for Walt's place, 5 miles out and sitting at the bottom of that hollow, there was no realistic chance the siren would ever reach them at all. Whatever warning they got, they'd have to find some other way. My wife stood in the kitchen doorway that evening with a dish towel in her hands while I walked through the plan out loud, the way I always did before a serious storm day, more for my own peace of mind than anything else. She asked what time I was planning to leave the next morning. I told her it depended on the storms, probably late morning, because I wanted to get ahead of whatever was coming rather than chase it from behind. Ahead of what, she asked, not unreasonably. Nobody really knows yet, I told her, and grinned in a way I meant to be reassuring. That's the whole question, isn't it? She didn't smile back the way she usually did at that particular joke between us. Instead, she folded the dish towel over twice, hung it carefully on the oven handle, and told me quite plainly that she had a bad feeling about this particular one. I told her gently that she had a bad feeling about all of them, which was more or less true, and that I'd have a bad feeling too if our positions were reversed. I told her I understood completely. She looked at me straight on, in a way she rarely did during these familiar pre-storm conversations, and told me no, I did not understand. I don't like this one, she said again, more slowly this time, like she wanted the words to actually land somewhere. I kissed the side of her head and went out to the garage to check my tire pressure. And I want to be honest with you about something I've never fully admitted to anyone else, including my own wife. Standing out there with a tire gauge in my hand, I felt something low and heavy sitting in my stomach. And at the time I told myself it was nothing more than the usual excitement I always felt before a big chase day. I've spent decades since wondering whether that feeling was actually something else entirely, some kind of early, unrecognized dread, and whether excitement and dread had simply always felt identical inside my own body, right up until the one day they finally proved not to be the same thing at all. That evening, before the light fully faded, we drove out to Walt and Ellen's place, mostly because my son had been campaigning to see his cousin since the previous Sunday, and because Ellen had made one of her chess pies, which by that point had achieved a kind of legendary status in our extended family. I nearly suggested we skip the visit and stay home instead because the air already felt like it was building towards something, but I let Tobias talk me into it the way I usually did. Walt was out in the yard when we pulled up, working on a section of gutter with a pair of pliers, because Walt genuinely could not leave a single loose fixture on that house alone for more than a season without fixing it. Alan was inside grading papers at the kitchen table, third-grade spelling tests from the look of the stack. Marisol was out on the porch swing under a blanket, even though it was easily 75 degrees that evening, and I remember thinking, watching her wave us up the walk, that she looked genuinely, remarkably well. Better than she'd looked in 2 solid years. We ate pie. Walt and I got into our usual argument about a college football game from several years back that neither of us would ever fully let go of. My son and Marisol disappeared out onto the porch together, and through the screen door I could hear the two of them talking back and forth for the better part of an hour, punctuated every so often by a burst of laughter from one or the other of them. Before we left, I stood in the doorway with Walt for a moment, telling him plainly about the forecast for the following afternoon. Could be bad, I told him, keep an eye on it. He gave me his usual half-joking response, something about how they'd said the same thing last month and nothing had come of it. I told him I knew what they'd said last month and I was telling him what I actually thought this time. Dang, that bad, huh, he said. I told him honestly that I didn't know for sure. Could be nothing at all. But if the sky turns green tomorrow, I told him, don't stand out in the yard staring at it. Keep that culvert in mind. There was an old concrete culvert pipe down at the low end of their property, a leftover piece of infrastructure from back when the land had been worked as pure farmland, for feet across and bone dry most of the year. It wasn't much, but it was genuinely the best shelter option they had, since the house itself had no basement, same as roughly 9 out of every 10 houses in that entire county. Got the culvert, Walt said, then added, half-joking, that they already lived at the bottom of a hole in the ground as it was. The tornado's not coming down the hollow, he said, the way half the people in that county genuinely believed back then. This old, comfortable local myth that the surrounding hills would somehow shield the low ground from anything serious. Wish that's how it actually worked, I told him. It's not. We said our goodbyes. Ellen sent us home with a slice of pie wrapped in aluminum foil. Marisol gave me her biggest hug of that entire spring on the way out and reminded me quite seriously that she loved my ugly flannel shirt and that I was absolutely forbidden from ever getting rid of it. My son and I climbed into the truck and headed home. He was unusually quiet for the first mile or so, which for him was practically a medical anomaly. When he finally spoke, he told me Marisol had been acting weird that afternoon. Not bad weird, he clarified quickly when I asked him not to be unkind about his cousin. Happy weird, he said. Really, really happy and unusually quiet. She'd mostly just sat there smiling at things, laughing at whatever he said without contributing much of her own conversation, which apparently was not like her at all. He told me she'd said exactly one memorable thing that whole afternoon. He'd asked her at some point if she was doing okay and she'd told him simply that she'd been ready for a while. Ready for what, I asked him. He didn't know. She hadn't explained further and he hadn't pushed her on it. A little further down the road he asked me quietly if Marisol was getting sick again, and I made what I now consider one of the worst mistakes of that entire week. though it seemed harmless enough at the time. I assumed he meant he was scared she was dying, that he'd picked up on some kind of making peace energy from her that afternoon. So I reassured him, clearly and confidently, that she was doing better than she had in 2 full years, that the doctors were sure of it, that everything was going to be fine. Saying those words out loud, I felt in some part of myself I couldn't fully articulate, like I was reassuring myself just as much as I was reassuring him. Thursday, May 9th, 1991. I woke up before 4:30 that morning with a pressure sitting in my chest that a decade of chasing had taught me to trust without question. I went out the back door in my robe and stood in the yard, and even at that hour it was 71 degrees and humid enough that the grass was wet without any dew having actually fallen yet, which is its own small, unsettling detail if you know what to look for in a Kansas spring morning. The wind was coming steadily out of the south-southeast, moving with a kind of constant, purposeful energy rather than the usual gusting pattern, like something out there was pulling it toward itself with real intention. By 6 o'clock, the weather radio confirmed a severe thunderstorm watch for the southwestern part of the state, and I felt my hands go cold listening to that flat computerized voice reading out county names, even though the affected area was still a solid 2 hours away from us at that point. My wife made eggs. Our son ate his standing up at the counter the way he always did when he was too keyed up to sit still, and she made him sit down anyway the way she always did in return. It was, in every visible way, an entirely ordinary morning in our house, the kind of morning you don't recognize as significant until you're looking back at it from the other side of everything that follows. Before he left for school, my son asked me one more time to make sure I got him a good storm photo that day. Not like last time, he said, referencing a blurry, disappointing shot from the previous spring that had become something of a running joke between us. I promised him I would. He got on the bus at 7:15, and I remember watching it pull away down our street with absolutely no idea that it was the last completely ordinary morning our family would ever have together. At 8 o'clock, I called Walt and Ellen's house from our kitchen phone. Ellen answered, and I could hear a radio playing faintly in the background, along with the sound of someone eating cereal from a bowl. I asked to speak with Walt, and she told me he was out on the back line fixing something, offering to go fetch him. I told her it wasn't necessary and asked her to just pass along that the storm was expected to reach them by early afternoon, and to keep their own radio on and stay close to that culvert, all of them, just in case. Now you're scaring me a little, Ray, she said, using the shortened version of my actual name that only family ever used. Good, I told her, then immediately felt bad for how blunt that sounded, and softened it by explaining I just wanted them to take real precautions, not that anything specific was necessarily going to happen there. It's a big state, I told her, trying to sound reassuring. Just being careful. I asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Marisol was up yet. Ellen told me she was still sleeping, that she'd had another rough night, the worst one yet by her own account. Up until nearly 4 in the morning, sitting alone in the kitchen with every light on, refusing to lie back down. Did she say anything, I asked. Ellen lowered her voice, the way you do when you don't want a sleeping child to overhear their own name being discussed. She's talking about the man in the field again, Ellen told me. Except now, apparently, according to Marisol, he'd moved. He wasn't standing in the field anymore. He was standing in the road. I don't know what to do with this, Ellen said, and I could hear real strain in her voice by that point. The doctors won't even discuss it seriously. They just want to run their usual tests again. He's in the road now, I repeated, mostly to myself, turning the words over without really knowing what to do with them either. I told Ellen I'd come by the following day to check on everyone properly, told her to have a good day at school, and hung up the phone. As I did, I remember consciously telling myself a comfortable, rational story about what was probably happening. 2 years of hospital stays and difficult treatments could put strange things into a child's mind, I told myself, combined with whatever quiet awareness she might have carried, somewhere underneath everything, about how close she'd actually come to not surviving those 2 years. The damage to a young mind doesn't necessarily undo itself just because the medical outcome improves, I reasoned. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable explanation at 8 o'clock that morning. I want you to remember that reasoning clearly, because by 3 o'clock that same afternoon, I would no longer have any comfortable explanation left to reach for at all. I went out to the garage, loaded 4 fresh rolls of film into my camera bag, checked my oil, and pulled out of the driveway at 11:40 that morning, heading west and slightly south, aiming to get up onto some higher ground where I could actually see what was building rather than getting caught reacting to it from behind. There was an old fire road off the highway up on a rise the locals called Maberry Ridge, where on a clear day you could see a good 20 miles out to the west. That particular Thursday was not, in any sense of the word, a clear day. Here is what I actually saw when I got up there around 12:15 that afternoon. To the west, a line of individual cumulus towers building up against the sky, not yet joined into a solid wall, each one looking almost like it was boiling over at the top. The base of the sky beneath those towers had taken on the specific dull gray-silver color that any experienced chaser learns to respect on sight. I sat on the hood of my Bronco drinking a Coke and watched that sky build for a solid hour, and I'll admit to you honestly that I was, in that hour, having the time of my life, completely unaware of how badly that particular feeling was about to curdle. Around 1:30, the tops of those towers began to flatten out and smear off toward the east at high altitude, the classic anvil shape forming as the rising air hit the upper boundary of the troposphere and had nowhere left to go but sideways. On two of the towers I could see a distinct overshooting top, a lump pushed up above the flat anvil surface, which told me the updraft inside that storm was punching hard enough to physically dent the tropopause before getting shoved back down. That's not a subtle signal. That's a storm telling you, in the clearest language available to it, exactly how much energy it's working with. The ground-level wind had swung around fully to the southeast by then, strong enough that I could feel it rocking my truck slightly on its springs, warm and heavy with moisture, running steadily toward those building towers like something invisible was actively pulling it in. At 2 o'clock, the weather radio finally caught up to what I was already seeing with my own eyes, issuing a tornado watch for my home county and 8 surrounding counties, set to remain in effect until 9 that night. At 2:40, the first tornado warning of the day came through for a county, 2 counties to my west, which told me somebody out there had either spotted something directly or seen enough on radar to be confident calling it in. I got moving, excited and genuinely nervous in roughly equal measure, driving down off the ridge and west along the highway to close the distance before the storm reached me instead of the other way around. I wanted to stay positioned southeast of it at all times, which is generally the safest viewing angle for a storm moving in its typical direction, and also the angle that would let me get clear quickly if things turned dangerous. The storm I ended up picking up was the middle one of the 3 towers I'd watched building earlier that afternoon, and by the time I got a good look at its base, I knew immediately I'd picked correctly. The whole underside of it was rotating, unmistakably, the entire structure churning slowly like something enormous being stirred from underneath. One corner had sagged noticeably lower than the rest of the cloud base, scooping up loose, torn scud clouds beneath it in a way that told me a wall cloud was actively forming. I pulled over near an old bridge crossing, grabbed my camera, and started burning through film as fast as I could manage. My hands were steady at first, despite the building wind, though they would not stay that way for much longer. The hail started small, dime and nickel-sized, and within maybe 4 steps of leaving my truck it had escalated to full golf ball size, hard enough that I threw an arm up over my head as I ran back for cover. My own boots slipped on the wet gravel alongside the driver's door, and I went down hard enough that I heard the impact before I fully registered the pain in my hand. I'd been holding my camera at the moment I fell, and I'd used it without thinking to catch myself against the ground. The back housing had sprung open on impact, hanging off one bent hinge, film pulled loose from its canister and exposed uselessly to the light. The prism housing on top was caved in along one corner, and the wind-on lever spun freely without engaging anything at all. I climbed into my truck, slammed the door, and looked down at what I'd just broken, and I want to tell you honestly that in that particular moment, before anything worse had happened yet, the emotion I felt most strongly was pure, uncomplicated fury at myself. I had 4 unopened rolls of film still sitting in my glove box and now nothing on God's earth to load them into. Then I thought of the promise I'd made my son that morning, and I cursed out loud in my empty truck, adding insult to injury by having broken that particular promise entirely by accident. 2 minutes later, the hail intensified even further, the noise inside my Bronco's cab becoming something close to standing inside a snare drum during a marching band rehearsal. A chunk of ice punched clean through my windshield at one point, leaving a hole roughly the size of a quarter and a spiderweb of cracks radiating outward from it. I drove east, pushing through the worst rain and hail combination I had ever personally experienced in over a decade of chasing, and came out the far side of it into something that stopped me cold. The world had gone completely quiet. I want to slow down here because this is the moment everything genuinely changed, and I've thought about how to properly describe it more times than I could count over the following 30 years. Nothing, in my experience up to that point, signaled that something dangerous was about to happen more reliably than the world suddenly going quiet around you. That's when I saw the birds. There were roughly 50 of them, blackbirds and grackles from what I could tell at that distance, and they were flying due west straight into the storm in a tight, deliberate formation rather than being scattered or blown along by the wind. I have been around birds in severe weather my entire adult life, and every single instinct I've ever developed tells you the same thing. Birds flee before humans even register that something is wrong. They have some extra sense for it, some early warning system built into them that we don't fully understand. That was the only time in my entire chasing career that I ever watched birds flying directly toward danger instead of away from it, and it has never happened again in all the years since. I watched them fly into that wall cloud and I never once saw them come back out the other side. I want to offer you a brief word of caution here, one that any experienced chaser learns the hard way sooner or later. Chasing storms at close range in genuinely terrible light does strange things to your own eyes. The clouds themselves begin to suggest shapes you half want to see rather than what's actually there. People, animals, buildings. I knew this fact intimately by 1991, having been fooled by my own imagination more times than I could count over a decade of chasing. I had trained myself deliberately never to trust anything I glimpsed for less than a full 3 seconds, specifically because of how unreliable your own perception becomes under those conditions. At 3:05 that afternoon, I was working my way down an old back road about 1.5 miles east of the wall cloud, the trees along the road giving way abruptly to an open soybean field. I pulled over there because the wall cloud itself, still southwest of my position, had begun turning visibly, growing more turbulent along its base. Lightning was constant now in the back half of the storm, strobing the entire field green-white every couple of seconds before dropping back into total darkness. On the third or fourth flash, I swear to you, there was a man standing in the middle of that soybean field, perhaps 200 yards out, facing directly toward my truck, arms hanging at his sides. Then the field went dark again. I waited, my whole body tensed, for the next flash of lightning, and when it came he was still there, except now one arm had risen, pointing east-northeast, past my position and off toward my left. I shouted something out loud that I genuinely don't remember, some wordless exclamation more than an actual sentence. I grabbed my binoculars off the passenger seat and raised them, waiting for the next flash, and when it finally came, the field was completely empty. Just soybeans, undisturbed as far as I could tell, no sign whatsoever that anyone had ever been standing out there at all. I set the binoculars down slowly, saying out loud to my empty truck, "What in the world was that?" And then, roughly 4 minutes later, the storm itself turned east-northeast, precisely the direction that figure had pointed. I know exactly how that sounds. A storm goes wherever the atmosphere tells it to go, not wherever some hallucinated figure in a bean field happens to be pointing. That's what I told myself in the moment, filing it away as nothing more than an unsettling coincidence born out of exhaustion and bad light and my own overactive imagination. I want to be completely honest with you about something. I did not connect that figure to my niece's nightmares in that moment. Not consciously, not right away. It would be some time yet before that particular connection finally forced itself into my awareness. And I've spent 30 years since wishing desperately that it had happened sooner. At 3:12, the tornado finally touched down, and I watched the entire process from beginning to end, which is a genuinely rare thing for a chaser to witness. Usually you arrive after the fact or lose the critical moment behind trees or terrain, and all you ever get to see is a gray, featureless wall. This time, I watched a hook of cloud descend cleanly off the southwest corner of the wall cloud, spinning visibly, while a ring of dust and loose debris rose to meet it from the ground below. The two connected in the middle over roughly 45 seconds, and when they finally met, the entire structure condensed at once, from the center outward, into a thin, gray-white rope shape. I remember thinking, in that first moment, that it might turn out to be a skinny, short-lived tornado, the kind that spins itself out within 3 or 4 minutes. It was not that kind of tornado. Over the following 90 seconds, it thickened steadily, moving from a rope shape into a cone, and from a cone into a full, solid wedge that blotted out a significant portion of the horizon behind it. And by then, I could hear it clearly, and I want to correct something you may have heard elsewhere because it genuinely surprised me the first time I experienced it up close. People say it sounds like a freight train, and it does not sound like a train at all. A train has rhythm to it, a repeating pattern you can follow. This was a flat, unchanging roar that never once varied in pitch, somehow simultaneously low and high at the same time, a sound I could feel resonating in my own bones rather than simply hearing with my ears. I did not enjoy that sound, not even slightly, despite over a decade of genuinely loving everything else about this particular hobby. I reached instinctively for my camera before remembering, with a fresh stab of frustration, that it was already broken. So I simply stood there, exposed and unprotected, and watched what remains to this day the single most spectacular and genuinely terrifying phenomenon I have ever witnessed with my own eyes. What I did not expect to see and what I want to explain carefully now were the tendrils. I want you to know, before I describe what I saw next, that this specific part is genuinely documented meteorological fact, and any qualified meteorologist would confirm it for you without hesitation. Large, powerful tornadoes are frequently not a single simple rotating column at all. They develop smaller subvortices that whip around inside the main circulation, tight secondary rotations that account for the seemingly random pattern of destruction you often see afterward. One house reduced to a bare foundation while its neighbor stands completely untouched 50 feet away. It's not the tornado somehow choosing its victims with intention. It's these secondary vortices carving unevenly through the landscape as the whole system moves forward. And sometimes, in a genuinely powerful tornado, these secondary vortices don't stay perfectly vertical. They can tilt, extending nearly horizontal off the main funnel's sidewall before curling back in on themselves. There's documented footage of this exact phenomenon from tornadoes in Oklahoma and in Kansas itself, if you'd like to look it up yourself and see precisely what I'm describing. So when I tell you that at 3:20 that afternoon, I watched that tornado extend what I can only describe as arms, I want you to understand that the underlying physics genuinely support what I'm describing. Knowing the physics, I promise you, does absolutely nothing to prepare you for actually watching it happen with your own eyes. There were 4 or 5 of these tendrils in total, emerging horizontally from the tornado's sidewall, each one perhaps 20 or 30 feet thick, extending outward 100 yards or more, curling and feeling their way along the ground surface as they moved. I watched one of them touch down briefly against a stand of trees, and I watched that entire stand simply disappear in the space of a few seconds. From where I stood, roughly a mile and a half away, it genuinely looked like something reaching out deliberately to touch a thing, purely to learn what it was before erasing it completely and moving on. One tendril emerged from the north side of the funnel and extended out over an empty pasture, and then it simply stopped there, hanging in place, slowly turning as though there was genuinely nothing out in that particular pasture worth its attention. It held that position for roughly 8 to 10 seconds before finally drawing back in toward the main funnel. I lowered my binoculars at that point, and I could feel my own stomach turning over with a dread that had nothing left to do with excitement anymore. Around 3:25, the rain thickened enough to seriously compromise my visibility, forcing me to reposition, and this is the point in the story where I made what I still consider the single worst decision of my entire life, though I want to walk you through exactly why it felt reasonable in the moment. Instead of heading south, away from the storm's projected path, I turned onto a gravel road running east, trying to beat the tornado to the next paved route before it could cut me off entirely. The gravel quickly turned to slick mud, and before I fully registered what was happening, I was climbing a grade in four-wheel low, my back end sliding sideways with every rotation of the tires, the roar behind me growing steadily louder. I genuinely feared, in that stretch of minutes, that the tornado would arrive on top of me before I ever saw it coming through the trees and rain. When I finally broke back out onto paved road, I was considerably closer to the tornado than any sane, experienced chaser should ever allow himself to get. Roughly 800 yards by my later estimate. I came out onto a blacktop road with a fence line running along my right side, the tornado sitting directly off my left shoulder, close enough that I simply stopped the truck in the middle of the road, because there was genuinely nothing productive left for me to do at that particular distance. My legs were shaking too badly at that point to trust myself to keep driving safely. The engine idled. My wipers ran full speed against rain that somehow continued falling even that close to the vortex itself. I sat there and watched this thing, and I noticed the sound of it actually shift, the flat, unchanging roar dropping away slightly, the visible debris field around its base, boards and sheet metal and unidentifiable dark shapes, appearing to slow down. Everything grew quiet enough for a moment that I could actually hear my own windshield wipers ticking back and forth again. Then I watched 2 more tendrils emerge from the near side of the funnel, one positioned higher than the other, both extending directly toward the road, toward my exact position, rather than curling and feeling along the ground the way the earlier ones had. They came out straight and stopped simultaneously, roughly 200 yards from the front of my truck, and held perfectly still, aimed directly at me. I want you to understand something about how that felt, because I don't think words fully capture it, even now, decades later. I do not believe, as a rational matter, that a tornado possesses eyes or a face, or any capacity whatsoever for genuine awareness. It is a column of air organized around a pressure deficit, nothing more. But there is a particular sensation that happens to every animal on this planet at some point. The specific moment a deer emerges from a ditch and looks directly at you, and you understand instantly and completely that you have stopped being scenery to that creature and have become, instead, a subject it is actively considering. That sensation is older than conscious thought. It lives somewhere beneath language entirely. That is precisely what happened to me standing beside my idling truck on that empty road. Every hair on both my arms stood up simultaneously. My mouth went completely dry. My entire body, all at once, arrived at a single certainty with no room left for doubt. It had just noticed me, and like any prey animal caught in that specific moment, I did not move. I could not have moved even if some rational part of my mind had insisted on it. At the base of the tornado, right at the churning edge of the visible debris field, in wind powerful enough to have stripped bare pavement off the road surface, I saw a familiar figure standing there. Impossibly, inexplicably standing, upright, unaffected by conditions that should have killed any human being instantly. Lightning caught him for a split second, his dark shape and his arms hanging at his sides, and then it went dark again and another flash came right behind the first one. As before, his arm was raised, pointing now east-southeast, not toward me directly but past me, over my right shoulder, out across the rolling hills beyond the road. I turned my head and looked in the direction he was indicating. There was nothing visible out there but green hills and heavy rain, stretching off toward what I knew to be roughly 8 or 9 miles of open Kansas countryside. When I looked back toward the tornado, its extended tendrils had already drawn back into the main funnel, the visible debris spinning faster than before, the roar returning to full volume so abruptly that I actually flinched hard enough to hit my elbow against the truck door. And I watched that tornado turn deliberately and completely east-southeast, precisely the direction that figure had just pointed. Every storm that entire afternoon, without exception, had been tracking steadily northeast, the typical and expected direction for storms moving through that part of the country. This one alone changed its heading at that exact moment, in the exact direction a man who could not possibly have been standing where I'd seen him had just indicated with his raised arm. That is the specific moment, if you're wondering, that I finally understood why an old man in Kansas might spend the rest of his life believing tornadoes are capable of genuine awareness. I got my truck moving again. About 2 miles down that road, my brain finally cleared enough to register a piece of information I badly needed to process. I needed to know where this thing was actually heading now. I pulled off at a wide spot in the shoulder and spread my top county map across the steering wheel, tracing with one finger the path I'd watched it take. East, then east-northeast, and now east-southeast from approximately my current position. I followed that line outward across the paper. My finger crossed a creek, crossed the northern edge of a ridge the locals called Mab's Rise, and came down into a small, pinched-in green pocket on the map with a thin blue line running through its lowest point. Miller's Hollow. I sat there staring down at my own finger resting on that map, not wanting in any part of myself to believe what I was looking at. I told myself quickly and desperately that it would likely stay on the ground only another 25 minutes or so before thinning out and dying, the way most tornadoes eventually do, or that the surrounding ridgeline itself might simply choke it off entirely. But when I looked back up through my windshield out toward the southeast, the storm was still clearly going, still moving steadily in exactly the direction I did not want it to go. It was heading directly for Miller's Hollow, directly for my brother's house. The man in that field, in that road, had been pointing at that exact location the entire time, in every single version of himself I had now personally witnessed twice. I floored the accelerator, tearing loose gravel and probably a portion of my own tire tread in the process. In that moment, I had exactly 3 separate ideas of what I might realistically do, and I worked through all 3 of them in rapid succession. The first was to make a phone call. There was a small roadside store at the junction of that blacktop and the highway, sitting up on cinder blocks, selling bait and beer to whoever passed through, with a pay phone mounted on its exterior wall. I reached it in roughly 6 minutes, jumping out of my truck without bothering to close the door behind me, yanking the phone receiver up to my ear. There was no dial tone, Not even static. A line was down somewhere between me and any functioning exchange, which meant calling anyone at all had just become impossible. I went inside briefly, where an older man behind the counter let me try his own transistor radio, but I got nothing useful from it either. I later learned from a deputy who mentioned it afterward that I'd come across to that store owner as something close to a lunatic, pale and frantic, shouting something about a young girl in a valley before abandoning the radio and bolting back outside. The second idea was my CB radio. Back in my truck, up on the highway proper, I worked the microphone through channel 19 first, then switched to channel 9, the designated emergency frequency that someone somewhere was theoretically supposed to be monitoring at all times. Nothing useful came through on either. I went back to channel 19 and picked up scattered, distant voices, multiple overlapping conversations bleeding together from far enough away that most of it wasn't even local traffic. If I managed to reach anyone at all through that static, I understood immediately that it would be someone who couldn't possibly reach a working phone in town within the next 10 minutes, and who almost certainly had no idea what or where Miller's Hollow even was. And then, on channel 9, in the brief gap between two of my own failed transmissions, I heard a voice. A girl's voice, coming through with unusual clarity given everything else I'd been hearing, and it spoke exactly 2 words, delivered in a tone that carried absolutely no trace of fear whatsoever. "It's okay," the voice said. "I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that it sounded exactly like Marisol." But my brother did not own a CB radio of any kind, had never owned one in all the years I'd known him. I must have been hearing things, I told myself, gripping the microphone hard enough to hurt my own hand. Tell me I was only hearing things. The third idea, and the only genuine option remaining, was simply to drive. So I drove. The highway south from that junction ran 9 miles to the turnoff for Miller's Hollow, through 2 sharp, blind curves and down a genuinely steep hill descending off the main ridge. I made that distance in a little under 8 minutes, passing a stalled sedan along the shoulder at one point, its hazard lights flashing, 2 occupants staring upward through their own windshield, almost certainly convinced that whoever I was, I had lost my mind for still being out on that particular road at that particular moment. The storm stayed on my right side the entire way south, and I couldn't shake the specific feeling that if I could still see it, it could somehow still see me in return. By that point, it had moved into the tree-covered ridge itself, its base grown so wide it genuinely looked like a section of the sky had physically come down and planted itself directly on the ground. A wide smear of brown and green debris hung suspended ahead of the visible funnel, pieces of the landscape itself being lifted and carried along. At one point, I watched a sheet of tin roofing spinning nearly 400 feet up in the air, a half-mile off to my right, moving with the strange, unnatural grace of some enormous, impossible bird. I finally reached the top of the hill leading down into the hollow. A fallen pine already blocked the westbound lane entirely, forcing me onto the shoulder to get around it before making the turn onto the gravel descent. About 200 yards down that road, the grade steepens sharply enough that you have to ride your brake continuously the entire way down, and the trees on both sides lean inward until they completely close off any view of the sky above you. You're driving, essentially, through a tunnel at that point, unable to see where the tornado actually was or which direction it happened to be moving in relation to your own position. I had genuinely no way of knowing how much time I had left. There was only that single road in and the same single road back out. I calculated it would take roughly 4 minutes from my current position to reach my brother's house, and I already knew from the sound alone that the tornado was already descending the ridge directly above me. I was driving completely blind, heading straight downhill into the exact location I already knew it was heading toward. That tornado was large enough, by that point, to have picked my entire truck up and deposited it in a tree somewhere in a different state entirely. No matter how fast I drove, some part of my stomach kept insisting I wasn't going to make it there in time. And if I somehow did arrive too early instead, I understood with total clarity that I would simply die there alongside all of them, and my son would grow up without a father. I slammed on my brakes. I put the truck into park in the exact middle of that gravel road, and I climbed out, simply standing there in the open. God, I could hear it by that point. It had genuinely stopped being a sound at all in any conventional sense and had become pure physical pressure instead. It was unmistakably coming down that ridge, directly into the hollow with everything it had. And that was considerably more than enough. I yelled. I stood alone on an empty gravel road in the middle of nowhere and shouted my brother's name directly into a tornado large enough to have swallowed an entire freight train whole. A moment later, all at once, it went completely dark, far darker than the storm alone should have made it, and the rain began driving nearly horizontal. Something struck my truck from behind hard enough to leave a dent the size of a bowling ball in the tailgate. I dropped down into the roadside ditch on the uphill side, pressed my face into the wet dirt and covered my head with both arms, and I stayed there. It passed directly over the top of my position. Did not take me with it. It continued on down into the hollow, carrying everything it had, and all I could do was lie in that ditch, my ears popping painfully twice in quick succession, while the entire world roared around me for what felt like considerably longer than it likely actually was. The whole event lasted roughly 90 seconds before the sound finally began to fall away. I got up eventually, caked head to toe in mud, a fresh cut across the back of one hand that I genuinely couldn't tell you the exact moment I'd received. The rain had stopped entirely by then, that abruptly, and the light around me had already begun brightening again. A new wind was moving up through the hollow now, running in the opposite direction from the storm's own path. I climbed back into my truck and drove the rest of the way down carefully, navigating around a section of the road blocked by a fallen hardwood tree roughly 30 inches across, eventually having to abandon the vehicle entirely and cover the final half-mile on foot. I came around the last bend at a jog. The hayfield across from Walt's property had been scoured down to bare red mud, the entire field looking as though it had been placed inside some enormous machine and processed all at once, while patches of grass mere feet away sat completely untouched. Walt's own truck had been thrown into the tree lane roughly 150 yards from where it had originally been parked, folded up like a piece of wet paper. And where the house itself had stood, there was simply nothing left at all. I want to be precise about what I mean by that because I've walked plenty of damage paths in my professional life alongside Weather Service surveyors, and I understand exactly what an F4 tornado typically leaves behind. A genuine debris field. 100-yard scattering of lumber and insulation, someone's clothing hanging in a tree branch, a comprehensive record of destruction you can actually walk through and catalog. This was not that. There was a bare, swept foundation slab, a row of concrete blocks, a few pipes rising out of the ground where plumbing fixtures had once connected. But all of it was bare. Genuinely, completely bare, as though the winds had been violent enough to sandpaper the entire surface clean of everything that had once stood there. Rainwater had already collected and gone still in one low corner of the foundation. Not a single board remained anywhere on that property. The porch itself, that entire structure Walt had built with his own hands over years of careful weekend work, had been removed down to its anchor bolts, which stood up out of the bare concrete with their nuts still threaded onto them. Here is the detail I have never once managed to stop thinking about in all the years since. The foil-wrapped pie dish Ellen had sent home with us 2 nights earlier was sitting upright in the grass, roughly 20 feet from the edge of that bare slab, completely empty, completely undisturbed, and completely untouched by anything that had just happened around it. Walt was found roughly 3 hours later, along the fence line at the back edge of the property, still dressed in the same work clothes he'd put on that morning. Ellen had survived entirely, having been at the elementary school with her own class of 3rd graders in an interior hallway when the storm passed through the main part of town, kneeling on the floor with her students, hands over their heads, listening to hail hammering the roof above them. Marisol was never found. Search teams worked that hollow for 11 consecutive days. 200 volunteers by the second weekend, joined by National Guard personnel and search dogs. They walked the creek bed and both ridgelines in careful, methodical grid patterns, marked off with flagging tape. They dragged sections of the creek itself and pulled apart every scattered pile of debris within a 2-mile radius. There simply wasn't much debris to search through in the first place. They recovered scattered items miles from the property. A sock drawer found intact in a pasture a mile and a half northeast, family photographs discovered stuck flat against the side of a distant barn, but they never located Marisol herself, not in 11 days, not ever. A Weather Service surveyor came out afterward to formally rate the tornado, ultimately classifying it as an F4, the second highest rating on the damage scale used at the time. He mentioned to me, in the careful, measured language these professionals always use, that this particular tornado had left considerably more absence behind it than it had actual physical damage, and that its entire destructive path had ended precisely at my brother's foundation. It had traveled just over 13 miles on the ground that day, every single mile of it leading, in a nearly perfectly straight line, directly to that specific house. I continued chasing storms for another 25 years after that day. Most stories like this one, I think, are expected to end with the survivor selling off all his equipment and walking away entirely. That isn't what happened with me. I was back out chasing again that following June and every spring after that, right up until my own body finally forced me to stop. But I want you to understand that the reason I kept going had changed completely. I stopped chasing storms to see them. I started going out instead to watch them, which I understand sounds like a strange distinction to draw, but which has always felt to me like the only honest way to describe it. My son never once asked to ride along with me again, not even after he turned 13, the age I'd originally promised him. I never brought the subject back up myself, and neither did he. My wife has never enjoyed hearing me tell this particular story, and doesn't believe the stranger elements of it, even now, even after everything. I'm not here trying to prove anything to anyone. I'm simply telling you what I personally believe after living through it. I believe some tornadoes are genuinely, meaningfully aware. I believe that when certain ones touch down, they are moving towards somewhere specific they need to reach, and that they will not stop moving until they arrive there. Did that storm choose my brother's house, specifically, deliberately, out of every other house it could have chosen across 13 miles of open Kansas countryside? I genuinely don't know. I only know what I personally witnessed twice with my own eyes, on one single afternoon in May of 1991. Consider, if you're willing to, exactly how little any of us actually understand about these things. The single most destructive moving phenomenon on this entire planet, and yet nothing about it is supposed to be alive in any meaningful sense. Or is it alive, somehow, in a way we simply haven't developed the language or the science to properly describe yet? That's Grady's story, and I want to be honest with you about something before we move on. I don't know what to tell you about the figure in that field, or the voice that came through his radio, or a storm that changed its entire heading on a night when every other storm across the state held its expected course. I only know that Grady still steps outside every single spring when the air starts to feel wrong, and watches the sky the same way he has for over 40 years now. Some part of him, he told me, is still hoping it comes back. Some other part of him, he admits, is genuinely afraid that it might. That's tonight's story, and I want to thank Grady personally for trusting me enough to finally tell it. If you've ever experienced something during a severe storm that you still can't fully explain, I would genuinely love to hear about it. You can send your own story through the link in the description below. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and keep one eye on the sky and subscribe my channel.